November 1979. Fanatical supporters of Iran's new leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini, storm the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and take everyone they find there hostage. American citizens, soldiers, and diplomats, bound, blindfolded, paraded before the world. Images of humiliation and helplessness sear their way into the hearts and minds of America. The greatest power on earth, unable to deal effectively with a nation that sometimes seems possessed by madness. This is the story of 444 days that changed the course of history. A time of outrage and heartbreak, of broken promises and dashed hopes, of a king without a country, and a president held powerless in the fierce grip of Islamic fundamentalism. It was a time when heroes died in a tragically failed rescue mission. And finally, it was time for freedom. At the moment, America turned to a new leader. Through it all, ABC News was there. Watch now the original ABC News broadcasts of a great TV news story. America held hostage, the Iran crisis. From ABC News, great TV news stories with Peter Jennings, Ted Koppel, Frank Reynolds, Hugh Downs, Barbara Walters, Max Robinson, Sam Donaldson, Tom Jarrell, Bob Dyke, and the worldwide resources of ABC News.
From ABC in New York, this is World News Tonight, Sunday, with Sam Donaldson.
Good evening. The U.S. Embassy in Tehran has been invaded and occupied by Iranian students. The Americans inside have been taken prisoner, and according to a student spokesman, will be held as hostages until the deposed Shah is returned from the United States, where he's receiving medical treatment for cancer. Some reports say as many as 90 Americans may be involved. Others say as few as 35. A look at what has happened in Tehran, as narrated by Richard Anderson.
The American hostages were blindfolded, handcuffed, and marched out on the U.S. Embassy's front steps by the revolutionary students. The Iranians had fought U.S. Marine guards for 3 hours for control of the embassy. The Marines used tear gas, but were eventually overrun at 5 o'clock this morning, New York time, as revolutionary guards and local police stood by and watched. While the Iranians burned an American flag in front of the embassy, they said the takeover had the express blessing of the Ayatollah Khomeini. In return for their American hostages' freedom, they're demanding the United States give up the deposed Shah of Iran from his hospital bed in New York to stand trial before a people's court. Until that is done, the demonstrators refuse to make any promises about the fate of the American hostages. Immediately after the takeover, the crowd put up pictures of the Ayatollah and a banner identifying themselves as Khomeini followers. Iranian women wearing the traditional black chadors could be seen inside the compound gate. Outside, newsmen and women waited for any information. But one fact is clear tonight, that for the second time in a year, Khomeini demonstrators in Tehran have overrun the American embassy and now appear in control of as many as 90 American lives. Richard Anderson, ABC News.
The action against the embassy may or may not have been ordered by Iran's religious leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini. That is not clear, but it does appear to have his blessing. A spokesman in the holy city of Qom said the move has the Ayatollah's personal support, which adds to Washington's difficulty in trying to resolve this dangerous situation. Ted Koppel, our diplomatic correspondent, is standing by at the State Department with the latest on that. Ted?
The State Department is doing what it can, but for the moment at least, that doesn't appear to be much. There has been no direct contact with the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. That building is under the total control of the demonstrators. During the takeover, by coincidence, the senior American diplomat in Iran, Bruce Langan, the Chargé d'affaires, was at the foreign ministry. He has remained there throughout the day, acting as Washington's main link to the Iranian government. The State Department has set up a special task force in a small room next to the operations center. The force is headed by Assistant Secretary of State Harold Saunders. But Secretary of State Vance himself came in this morning, stayed until early afternoon, and twice briefed President Carter, who's up at Camp David, by phone. So far, official comments about the incident have been a model of restraint, an expression of concern for the safety of American personnel and property, and a statement of appreciation that the Iranian government has made some efforts to resolve the matter. Sam?
Ted, the Ayatollah's support for this action is ominous, is it not?
Well, it may or may not be ominous. The State Department is making a particular point to distinguish the Ayatollah Khomeini from the Iranian government. That's why it's being so restrained in its direct references to the government.
It seems to me this is another situation where a lot of people's first instinct might be to use military force, but apparently Washington is not going to do that.
Well, first of all, it probably wouldn't work, Sam, and secondly, in one word, oil. Washington is tremendously concerned about Iran's oil supplies and our need for them, and of course concerned about the safety of those Americans still at the embassy.
About 500 Iranian youths continue to occupy the embassy compound here in Tehran, while close to 2,000 supporters outside the gates rallied in support of the takeover. There was no sign of any of the hostages. We understand they are being kept inside one of these buildings, but we were not told which building. We were told the captive Americans are being treated well, but their needs are being looked after. We were also told that they are being interrogated and that some of them will be brought before newsmen when their interrogation is finished. That may be tomorrow or later this week. At a news conference inside the compound, we were shown photographs taken yesterday of U.S. Marine Guards at the embassy after they were taken prisoner and blindfolded by their captors. Members of the Student Occupation Committee also displayed some weapons they say they seized during the takeover. And a punctured poster of Khomeini, the committee charged, was used as a dartboard by a senior U.S. official. Khomeini's son attended the news conference to confirm his father's endorsement of the takeover, and we understand to exert a moderating influence among those inside the compound.
This is Barry Dunsmore. The U.S. does not have a great number of options in dealing with what is a very sensitive situation in which there is no central authority. But one thing is certain. There will be no bowing to the mob's demand for the return of the Shah.
In answer to the question, are we considering handing him over, or are there any plans to do so or to meet that demand, the answer is no.
Here in Washington, there is a growing sense of helplessness as well as outrage. The civilian government of Iran, headed by Prime Minister Bazargan, resigned today. And the students, or whoever have seized the embassy there, have threatened to kill the hostages if the U.S. makes any military move to rescue them. So both the White House and the State Department today again ruled out the use of force to save the captive Americans. We have a series of reports tonight. First, with this exclusive account of today in Tehran, here is Bob Dyke.
It is a sight to make any American here in Tehran feel insecure. Hundreds of Iranian demonstrators outside the U.S. Embassy calling for the death of President Carter. One poster showed the president tied to a stake, ready for execution beside the former Shah. To the demonstrators, the student seizure of the embassy and its occupants is the best thing to have happened here since the Islamic Revolution, the fall of the Shah and the rise of the Ayatollah Khomeini. The students in control of the grounds held another news conference today. They did not, as they had promised earlier, allow reporters to see any of the Americans held captive in a nearby building. But they did issue a warning to the United States government that any overt attempt to free the hostages would have tragic results.
In case the United States decide to do something like Entebbe airport, as the Israelis did it in Uganda, if they want to do something like this, to release these hostages, you must be sure that they will definitely be killed.
Here in Tehran tonight, there are reliable reports that student activists have taken 2 more U.S. citizens into custody. They are William Royer and Catherine Cook of the Iran-American Society. The report says Monday they were taken from their office to the U.S. Embassy where they were locked up. Bob Dyke, ABC News, Tehran.
This is Ted Koppel at the State Department. Since this crisis began, the U.S. government hasn't had a great deal of leverage in Iran. Now it has even less. The only officials left at the foreign ministry in Tehran are second-rank functionaries who themselves don't know how much authority they have. State Department spokesman Harding Carter summed up the dilemma of negotiating with what is almost a phantom government.
We continue to contact whatever officials are available to discuss the matter with them. We are clearly in a changing situation, and which we simply must await now. The accession to power of whatever group represents the Revolutionary Council, whoever it is that's going to run the place.
Look at this. One American, blindfolded, handcuffed.
today in the courtyard of the American Embassy in Tehran. He and 60-some others still held hostage and threatened in a country gone out of control. The pictures exclusive, as are so many more in this broadcast.
This is an ABC News special. The Iran crisis. America held hostage. From Washington, correspondent Frank Reynolds.
Good evening. The special report that we planned to bring you tonight was about domestic politics, the battle among the Democrats. But we think the crisis in Iran is more urgent right now than the campaign here at home. Some 60 Americans, including our fellow citizen whom you just saw bound and blindfolded, are now beginning their 6th day of captivity inside the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. It's Friday morning there now, but throughout this night in Washington, officials will continue their search for some way to negotiate the hostages' freedom. That search was not successful today. In this broadcast, we'll have reports on the diplomatic efforts to resolve the problem and on other aspects of the crisis as well. But we begin now with an on-the-scene account by the one American television correspondent who has been there since the beginning, the seizure of the embassy last Sunday, and who, with his crew, has provided us with outstanding coverage all this week. Here is Bob Dyke in Tehran.
This picture tells it all. This flag was apparently taken from someone's office inside the United States Embassy. It was burned Tuesday evening outside the embassy's gates. To the Iranian demonstrators who set fire to it, this was a symbol of victory. This morning, for the first time since the hostages were put under lock and key, one of the captives, blindfolded, was brought out into the open.
He is Harry Rosen, the embassy's press attaché.
He was turned to face reporters and cameramen and several hundred Iranian demonstrators outside the embassy's gates. "Yankee, go home," they cried, but they made no attempt to harm him. Eventually, he was led back to join the other captives who have been kept out of sight.
The United States is in this fix because the former Shah of Iran is suffering from cancer and is receiving needed treatment in this country. But that explanation, that justification for his presence here is not accepted by the Iranians, who have always suspected the United States was the Shah's ultimate destination. Here's a report from Barry Dunsmore.
February. The Iranian mobs have driven the Shah out, and the question of where he goes becomes an important factor in U.S. policy toward Iran. Initially, it's assumed he will come to the U.S. President Carter even says so publicly. However, it soon becomes evident that the Shah will be an unwanted guest. March, and the Shah is in Morocco. The administration is looking for an emissary to ask the Shah not to come to the U.S. because of the delicate state of relations between Washington and the new regime in Tehran. David Rockefeller and Henry Kissinger are approached. Both angrily refuse, and instead, Kissinger begins a strong campaign to get the Shah into this country. April, Kissinger meets privately with Secretary Vance and also talks to the president. In each case, his message is, a man who for 37 years was a friend of the United States should not be treated like a Flying Dutchman who cannot find a port of call. At this point, Kissinger turns south. He is in direct contact with Mexican President Lopez Portillo. Without too much persuasion, the Mexicans agree to give the Shah a visa. July, Richard Nixon joins the campaign to admit the Shah. He visits him in Mexico and makes the point that this is no way to treat our friends. September, and the administration is still holding firm. Vance makes the point stronger than he's ever made it. Admitting the Shah may seem right, but I do not think it would be in our national interest to do so. He adds, we have had to take into account the possible dangers to American people. He clearly has the embassy compound in mind. Early October, the Shah is ill, and Rockefeller is contacted. He recommends a New York specialist, Dr. Benjamin Keene. Keene goes to Mexico. He finds the Shah very ill and learns of his long bout with a form of cancer. Late October, top officials contemplate the next step. The State Department's number 3, David Newsom, who was the top man on Iran, argues that admitting the Shah, even under these circumstances, could be dangerous. However, the president decides the Shah should be let in.
Either from the side of Islam and...
An enraged President Sadat is awaiting word on his offer to fly the Shah to Egypt. doctors and all. In 2 years, the Egyptian leader has never been as publicly agitated or furious as he is over the Iranian hostage situation.
Today I say shame on the world, and mainly on the Muslim leaders all over the world, because that what is done under the name of Islam, exploiting Islam, should have been condemned by them and should be condemned by them. Some of them are not so far from the same fate.
One thing Sadat cannot do to help resolve the problem is mediate. His hatred of Khomeini is no secret.
I have no relations with Khomeini, as you know. I have no relations, and I shall not be happy at all to have this relation again with such a lunatic like this man.
Sadat predicts Iran will soon fall into the hands of the leftists, the communists. For the moment, Sadat's only recommendation to the U.S., don't give in. Doreen Kays, ABC News, Cairo.
A view at last of some of the hostages. This film was first transmitted on the state-owned television network tonight here in Iran. The Swedish ambassador went to see them today, along with diplomats from France, Algeria, and Syria. It was a mercy mission, they said, to see how the prisoners were being treated. The diplomats were apparently invited to come by the Iranian students who have occupied the grounds for a week. The Swedish ambassador said he managed to talk to a few of the hostages to ask them how they were bearing up to their confinement.
Not received any major complaints with regard to their health. Of course, they seem tired, which is natural. But our impression is that their health conditions are generally good.
Pope John Paul's ambassador to Iran went to see the hostages today to offer some encouragement, but there wasn't much he could say. Last night, the Ayatollah Khomeini refused to consider the Pope's appeal on behalf of the prisoners. Today, 1 week after the embassy was taken over, this film surfaced. It is perhaps the only visual record of the compound as it was seized by the young Iranians. The silent 8mm film shows a march in the beginning, students climbing a fence and showing a banner inside the compound. "We are not going to bother you," the banner said. What happened after that, you can see for yourself. The hostages, moments after they were blindfolded for the first time. Others without blindfolds being led away. There are no signs on this film of resistance by the embassy staff, and no one appears to be armed. Bob Dyke, ABC News, Tehran.
Because of the continuing crisis in Iran, the president canceled a scheduled trip to Pennsylvania today, and ABC News White House correspondent Sam Donaldson reports tonight that Mr. Carter may not go anywhere until the hostages are released. It is even suggested there may be no campaign blitz around the country, now planned for after the president's scheduled re-election announcement on December 4th. Today, Iran made the first move. Within hours, the United States responded, and now the 11-day-old crisis between the two countries has moved into a new phase. This was the sequence. Iran declares its intention to withdraw all its assets from the United States. They claim $12 billion worth. The United States says no more than $6 billion. President Carter then formally declares a national emergency and blocks or freezes all property and funds of the Iranian government in this country, meaning they can't withdraw anything. And in still another counter-move, the Secretary of State rushes to New York to try to block Iran's demand for a meeting of the UN Security Council, an action virtually unprecedented for this country to take. But then, it is also unprecedented for diplomats and embassy employees to be held hostage in and by the country that is supposed to be their host. ABC News diplomatic correspondent Barry Dunsmore has obtained portions of a psychological profile of the Ayatollah compiled by American intelligence agencies. Here is his exclusive report.
The father of the latest Iranian revolution is, according to U.S. intelligence, a philosopher-theologian, xenophobic, narcissistic, politically and administratively naive. He suffers from some mental degeneration related to his age. He's described as a generalist who doesn't like to deal in details. This particular trait often creates confusion, as many of his pronouncements lack precision, leaving his followers to interpret what he has said or ordered. One analyst says, "We suspect he often doesn't know what his followers are doing in his name." As for the siege at the embassy, no one doubts he inspired it because his revolution was fading. It's felt he's not involved in the details, but that he certainly has the power to end it. Holding America hostage is in character for the Ayatollah because he so strongly detests the U.S. for its support of the Shah, who is his lifetime enemy, but also because he considers Americans Satan's people and leaders of the decadent West. When it comes to resolving the crisis, the picture the U.S. analysts paint is not very optimistic. They say he has little capacity for compromise and doesn't negotiate in any Western sense. It's said that Westerners who have tried to negotiate with him have found him implacable. He will sit with his eyes half shut and utter monosyllables or nothing at all. According to one analyst, he seems to be saying, "I'm tolerating you because someone told me I should, but you're not going to influence me." Khomeini cannot be intimidated by threats to his person and does not care what the rest of the world thinks. He can, however, be influenced, according to one intelligence observation, sometimes by the last person he talked to, but this person has to be close. It's for this reason that the U.S. hasn't tried, until very recently, to make direct contact with him. Intermediaries are still considered the best approach, and evidently there are people very close to Khomeini with whom the U.S. still feels it can deal.
All day the world has waited to see the release of 5 women and 8 black men who have been held for 15 days. But in Iran today that did not happen, as Bob Dyke reports.
To begin with, a surprise. There were only 3 hostages, although one of them told newsmen in the embassy compound that more might be released in a day or two. Not all of the captives, just a few of them. Left to right, the 3 were Marine Sergeant Liddell Maples, Kathy Gross, an embassy secretary, and Marine Sergeant William Quarles. Newsmen didn't have an opportunity to follow up any of the hostages' replies.
They're very upset and they have no idea what's going on. They can't communicate with each other and they aren't receiving any news while they're in there.
Myself, I was tied up the first day and a few days after I was tied up, but I haven't been tied up the whole 2 weeks that I've been here.
I believe that any country that doesn't want another country to interfere has the right to say so. And if there's anything that I can do about it when I get back to the United States, like I said, all I can do is tell them what I'm seeing right now.
They seemed to bear no grudges.
Well, I feel good about it. I've been treated pretty good here, and since I've been here the last 2 weeks, I've made pretty good friends with some of my captives. And in a way, I kind of hate to say goodbye to them. Some of them are pretty nice people, and I've learned a lot from what I've read and what I've seen and I've heard from them, and I'm very saddened about some of the things that have been going on during the Shah's regime.
2 weeks after the seizure, there is only one man who can order the hostages' release. This afternoon, in the holy city of Qum, we talked with the Ayatollah Khomeini. Will you release the hostages? When will you release the hostages? Will you release the hostages, and when will you release them?
These days, international regulations indicates that the spies be in the place of the diplomats, in the name of diplomats, in the name of Kardar and the rest, the council. It is not the case. The diplomats in any country are supposed to do the diplomatic work, not the crimes or the espionage. But if they do that, the act of espionage, and trying to place a government instead of a legitimate government, then at that time they are no longer diplomat. And this is what our people have done, take a certain number of spies, and they should be, according to our laws, tried and punished.
Despite the grimness of the situation and the 49 hostages still held in Tehran, there was a contrastingly happy start to the day 19 of the crisis, Thanksgiving Day. 13 hostages, women and black men, who were released from the embassy a few days ago, returned home to emotional reunions with their families. There was an attempt to keep their homecoming ceremonies low-key out of regard for the safety of the 49 co-workers who remain in the hands of the Iranian mobs and the Ayatollah Khomeini. And today, the Ayatollah himself voiced a threat already made by his followers. If the Americans attempt a military rescue of the hostages, said the Ayatollah, the hostages would be killed. If we see their parachutists coming, we shall kill all of them. Meanwhile, the Shah has stayed quietly in a New York hospital. That's where Barbara Walters met with him this evening and became the first American journalist to talk with him since his arrival triggered the crisis. Well, not only the first American journalist, you're the first journalist, aren't you, that's talked to him?
I think so. I don't think any journalist has talked to him directly since really the last time we talked to him in Morocco, and that was 8 months ago. I should explain to you that we have no tape or film of this because the Shah felt that if we did, it would be shown in Iran and it could be misinterpreted, and so he just wanted to talk directly to me.
Now, with so much agony for the hostages and for the nation, is he going to leave, and when?
Okay, he says yes, he's going to leave. He wants very much to leave. He's going to return to Mexico. He hopes to leave within 2 weeks. His radiation treatment finished today. He has to have kind of semi-surgery, he said, on that gallbladder. He doesn't quite know when it's going to begin. He still has a stone in it. It depends on how he reacts to the radiation, but he's very anxious to go and hopes it will be within 2 weeks.
In spite of all this medical publicity, there are a lot of people are wondering, is he really sick? Do you think he's really sick?
Look, I'm not a doctor. Obviously. Since I saw him in Morocco, he seems to have lost about 15 pounds. He is very alert mentally. He was standing when I came in, dressed in a paisley robe and pajamas. He still has a tube in him. He says he has some pain, and he must have the surgery, and says if he did not come, he would have died.
By nightfall, the country's, if not the world's, attention was directed to the lighting of the national Christmas tree on the ellipse below the White House. But when President Carter's daughter Amy threw the switch, not all the lights came on. There was, said the president, a reason.
Around the periphery of this crowd, there are 50 small Christmas trees. One for each American hostage. And on the top of the great Christmas tree is a star of hope. We will turn on the other lights on the tree when the American hostages come home.
For more than 2 weeks now, ever since Mexico refused to readmit the Shah of Iran, the U.S. government has been involved in what officials here in Washington describe as a full-court press to find the Shah a new home. Well, they did. This morning, the Shah, his wife, his personal doctor, and 5 aides left Lackland Air Force Base on a flight to Panama. For the weekend, at least, the Shah's official party will remain on the island of Contadora.
It was hours before any reaction came here in Iran to the departure of the Shah from the United States. When it came from the students holding the embassy. The trial of the hostages, they said, is now firm. They were quoted on government radio here as saying, that's the minimum we can do.
It was late and rainy, with only a small crowd outside the gate when the word about the former Shah reached the embassy. By telephone, we reached one of the young militants inside, who repeated the threat to try the hostages. They will be tried for what?
For the spying.
How many of them?
All of them, I think that all of them are spies.
All of the hostages you hold are spies?
Yes.
As for the families of the American hostages on this Christmas Day, they received a message from President Carter praising their steadfastness and support as an inspiration to all of us, and concluding, the rightness of our position and the strength of our determination assures that we will prevail. For some of the hostage families, there was a brief glimpse of their loved ones in photographs of today's events released by the militants who hold them. Marine Sergeant Kevin Hermaning of Oak Creek, Wisconsin, was one of the hostages who was seen in these photographs today. His mother, Mrs. Barbara Tim, was in a Christmas gathering with the rest of her family when she saw the pictures.
Seeing his picture has been our Christmas gift. The circumstances of it, of course, is certainly very bitter. Obviously, they are using all their propaganda and sending things out just the way they want it to be sent out. But at least we can see with our own eyes that he is okay.
1 week ago tonight, the hostages were permitted Christmas Eve services. The Iranians took all the pictures, all the television film, finally made it available to the American networks today, without conditions. The pictures are not very good, really, not very clear, but at least we can see the faces of some of the hostages, and here in the background, a Christmas carol played by one of the visiting clergymen. We leave you tonight with the hope that for you and for them, 1980 will be a happy new year.
As of now, and it is past midnight in Iran, American journalists are no longer permitted to report the news. The Iranian ban, leading to the expulsion of all American news organizations, has gone into effect. Most journalists are expected out of the capital city by the weekend. Just before the ban, I talked to ABC's Bob Dyke in Tehran. Have Iranian authorities, Bob, given up the idea of trying to communicate with the American public?
No, I don't believe so. As a matter of fact, one of the officials with the Ministry of National Guidance here said that Iran will try to continue communicating with the United States through their embassy, and gave me the impression that perhaps Iran is planning a propaganda campaign.
Do you think we'll be allowed back in, or do you regard this as a permanent expulsion?
We've all but been assured by a spokesman at the Ministry of National Guidance here that American newsmen will be allowed to return to Iran someday.
For the next 3 months, America pursues diplomatic solutions to the hostage crisis. A stalemate develops in February when the Ayatollah Khomeini overrules all negotiations and declares that the Iranian parliament must decide the hostages' fate. Elections are in progress in Iran. A new parliament will not be installed for weeks. At home, the president's popularity declines. Frustration turns to anger as the hostage crisis enters its 5th month. The crisis deepens when America imposes new economic sanctions and breaks all diplomatic relations with Iran. But the world is unprepared for what happens next. The day is April 25th, 1980, day 174 of the Iran crisis.
Let me just tell you quickly that this is the hour when Good Morning America would normally begin. However, as those who've been watching so far this morning already know, there has been this startling new development in the Iran hostage crisis. That U.S. attempt to launch a military rescue of the American hostages in Tehran has been, as you have now heard several times, aborted. 8 U.S. servicemen killed in the process. First word came from administration officials just after midnight, and we are now waiting for President Carter himself to address the nation. During the night, there have been no further statements from the White House beyond the one that we just read to you. So let's now go to the President of the United States.
Late yesterday, I canceled a carefully planned operation which was underway in Iran to position our rescue team for a later withdrawal of American hostages who've been held captive there since November 4th. Equipment failure in the rescue helicopters made it necessary to end the mission. As our team was withdrawing after my order to do so, 2 of our American aircraft collided on the ground following a refueling operation in a remote desert location in Iran. Other information about this rescue mission will be made available to the American people when it is appropriate to do so. There was no fighting, there was no combat, but to my deep regret, 8 of the crewmen of the 2 aircraft which collided were killed. and several other Americans were hurt in the accident.
We tried, we failed, and we have paid a price. The bodies of 8 young Americans still lie in the Iranian desert, victims of the tragic end to a daring and dangerous attempt to rescue the hostages in Tehran. There, the embassy gates are still locked. The terrorists have strengthened their guard, and the hostages remain in captivity. So far as is known, they are safe. No action has been taken against them because their country tried to save them. We begin tonight with an account of how the attempt was made and why it failed. Here is Pentagon correspondent John McWethy.
The plan was to converge on Iran under cover of darkness. The staging area, Tabas, 200 miles from Tehran, an abandoned airstrip in the desert. From Egypt, 6 C-130 transports. From the aircraft carrier Nimitz, 8 helicopters. A highly secretive counterinsurgency team may already have been on the ground at the staging area, setting up communications. Over the Persian Gulf circled an electronics command post. With the stage set, the choppers moved in. One was forced down with engine problems. Another, lost in a sandstorm, forced to return to the Nimitz. 6 made it to the staging area, but there was a hydraulic failure, leaving 5. Too few for the mission to Tehran. President Carter ordered the mission scrubbed, not enough choppers to get everyone out with the margin of safety. With all this, a bus filled with Iranians drove by and were taken captive. They were released after the American force left the ground. After refueling, one chopper swung in the wrong direction in the darkness. Its blade caught a transport plane and both exploded into flames. 8 crewmen were dead and the bodies were left at the scene.
In Washington, a major development tonight. Secretary of State Cyrus Vance has resigned. He is the first casualty of a major split within the Carter administration over the wisdom of making that unsuccessful rescue attempt of the hostages in Iran.
First, I believe that 10 to 15 of the hostages would have been killed even if the raid had been able to go through and they had been able to reach the embassy. Secondly, it was a very difficult and complicated rescue operation to carry out many thousands of miles from home. In addition to that, I believe there's a strong likelihood that new hostages would have been taken.
Vance's resignation appeared to be a victory for the hardline policies of National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski. And even after the abortive rescue mission, Brzezinski was still threatening more military action.
The message is this: do not scoff at American power. Do not scoff at American reach.
The best clue as to what course we are on now comes from the man who has had the problem dumped in his lap. And from the day his appointment was announced, Edmund Muskie has done everything but completely rule out the use of force.
Obviously, my effort would be to deal with the peaceful options available to us.
On his first overseas mission, Muskie talked about reducing the visibility of Iran without reducing our efforts. In Brussels, he said he saw no military option which held out success and instead called for diplomatic ingenuity. This was a theme which he repeated at his first Washington news conference.
It seems to me that an aggressive pursuit of the diplomatic option is called for at this point.
A few of his old friends are mourning his death, and many of his countrymen seem to be rejoicing in it. But here in the United States, the death of the former Shah of Iran in an Egyptian hospital today is being discussed mainly in terms of how it may affect the Iranian hostage crisis. The Shah's last residence in a year-and-a-half-long exile was Egypt, and much of his time since he arrived there last March had been spent in a military hospital on the outskirts of Cairo. There he had undergone a number of operations and treatments designed to arrest the cancer which was spreading through his body. The end came at mid-morning in Cairo. Doreen Kays says the exact cause of death is still unclear.
The former Shah's Egyptian and French doctors have not yet released official details on the exact cause of death. Some medical sources say it was sudden hemorrhaging of an abscess in his pancreas. Others claim it was an infection in the lungs and other complications that caused death. At his bedside, when the ex-monarch died, the former empress, his 4 children, other family members, French and Egyptian doctors, and one of his American spokesmen, Mark Morse, who claims the deposed leader was lucid and alert almost to the end. Morse says the former Shah sensed death was near. And Morse, who helped him complete his memoirs 3 days ago, claims he did not die a bitter man.
He was bitter then? Not bitter. He's never been bitter. He's never had a bitter word to say about anyone.
throughout this year and a half that I've spent with him, which I think is remarkable.
The Shah's death has little impact in Iran. Despite continuing threats, the hostages, now held captive nearly 9 months, are never brought to trial, nor are they freed. Throughout the crisis, sporadic secret negotiations have taken place, but now even these back-channel talks are stalled. Iran is now consumed with internal political battles, while America turns its attention to the 1980 presidential campaign. The hostage crisis falls off the front page. Finally, in September 1980, the new Iranian government is in place, and the Ayatollah Khomeini is ready to deal. The day is September 12, 1980, day 314 of the Iran crisis.
Day 314 of the hostage crisis in Iran, and there has been a new and potentially significant development. The Ayatollah Khomeini himself has now declared his terms for releasing the 52 Americans. He did not mention putting them on trial, nor did he demand an apology from this country. Khomeini listed 4 conditions the U.S. must meet. First, return the late Shah's wealth. Second, release Iranian government funds now frozen in this country. Third, cancel any claims against Iran. And fourth, guarantee no political or military intervention in Iran. A spokesman for the Ayatollah said his message amounts to a kind of amnesty for the hostages. For the reaction of the United States, here is diplomatic correspondent Barry Dunsmore.
Khomeini's latest speech is considered by U.S. officials to be a positive sign. The U.S. could move to unfreeze most of the $8 billion in Iranian assets currently being held, though there are some serious legal problems. Secretary Muskie has in effect already committed the U.S. on paper to non-interference in Iran's affairs. As for the Shah's assets, that's somewhat more difficult because what and where they are is uncertain. The American government doesn't have them. However, as recently as last week, the U.S. repeated its position that Iranians should make their claims through U.S. courts. In addition, there are 2 important points Khomeini did not make. He said nothing about trials for the hostages, and he made no demands for an American apology.
From this point forward, President Carter and his team work feverishly to come to terms with Khomeini, but progress is slow. On November 4th, a day that marks 1 full year of captivity for the hostages, Ronald Reagan is elected President of the United States. At year's end, the hostages are still in Iran.
Impasse, stalemate, deadlock. That sums up the hostage crisis tonight after 416 days. No sign of any change in the Iranian terms for their release, and to be realistic about it, an even deeper mood of discouragement here in Washington, where officials who have struggled for so long to bring the hostages home are conceding now it won't be done by them. Our first report tonight is from diplomatic correspondent Barry Dunsmore.
Carter administration officials no longer hold out any hope that they can resolve the hostage crisis. Privately, they tell ABC News that what they are doing between now and January 20th is simply going through the motions. Spokesman John Tratner put it this way.
It's problematical that the hostages can be released before the end of this administration. You can look at the calendar, as I say, and draw some conclusions from it.
These are the obvious conclusions. Of the $24 billion Iran is demanding, President Carter can free up about $4 billion of Iran's assets in this country. But he can't and won't pay a $20 billion ransom. Unless there are trials, the U.S. won't use military force. And in the brief time remaining, there is no reasonable chance that a deal can suddenly be made.
One more note on Iran. At the request of the hostage families, the national Christmas tree here in Washington, dark for the 2nd year in a row now, except for the Star of Hope at the top, will be completely lighted tomorrow night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time for exactly 417 seconds, 1 second for each day of captivity. The families also hope that all Americans will flash a light or hold a candle outdoors at the same hour for the same length of time.
It was not what Dottie Moorfield and her family really wanted for Christmas. It was what they settled for. A glimpse of her husband in television pictures from Tehran. With her son Dan and daughter Betsy, she rose at dawn to watch news coverage of the hostages' Christmas ceremony.
Next should be Richard Moorfield coming up, who will be the embassy's consul general. This is Mr. Richard Moorfield right now.
To his family, Moorfield looked well. Thinner, they said, but not as gaunt as at Easter. the last time they saw him on television.
It's reassuring to see him. It's good to know that he's well, that he's all right. But there's an anger also that he's still there.
Almost as soon as the pictures aired, there were calls from friends who wanted to share the good news.
It's reassuring to know that he does look well.
The Moorfield house is filled with gifts and Christmas messages of encouragement. Mrs. Moorfield says the concern from all over the country makes the waiting more bearable.
It would have been impossible to get through without the support we've received. And certainly, I wish them all a Merry Christmas.
Well, 36 families waited in vain today to get a glimpse of their hostage relatives. Toni Sickman, mother of Marine Sergeant Rodney Sickman, said release of the films was used, quote, to butter us up. Said Mrs. Sickman, whose son did not appear on the films, I'm just mad at everything and everybody. I'm tired of it.
Good evening. It's done. On this 442nd day of captivity for the American hostages in Iran, an agreement to free them appears to have been reached. That's the word tonight from 3 countries, although only one, Iran, has said it publicly. And of course, the hostages have not yet been freed. Pars, the official Iranian news agency, announced an agreement some hours ago. And Iran's chief negotiator, Behzad Nabavi, has said the United States has sent word that it will sign it. But there is no official announcement yet from Washington.
The president returned from Camp David earlier than expected this afternoon, prepared to sign a variety of documents necessary to implement financial aspects of the agreement. The advisors he asked to meet his helicopter gave a hint as to the complexity. Accompanying him into the Oval Office were the Vice President, the Secretaries of State and Treasury, the Director of the CIA, and half a dozen others. That meeting has now been going on for more than 5 hours, and officials are hoping it will be the final conference on the hostages.
After 442 days of captivity, it all comes down to money. A year before, America had frozen $8 billion of Iranian assets. Those assets are the basis for the deal to free the hostages. In what may be the largest financial transfer in history, all $8 billion are to be transferred to the Bank of England. 1.4 of those billions are to be held in escrow against possible claims by U.S. banks. 3.7 billion are to be returned to the U.S. in payment of existing bank loans. Iran takes home surprisingly little, $2.9 billion. On January 19th, day 443, President Carter announces the deal to the nation.
We have now reached an agreement with Iran, which will result, I believe, in the freedom of our American hostages.
But Iran is not done with Jimmy Carter. Last-minute delays keep President Carter working until the last moment of his presidency. ABC News brings the nation inside the Oval Office to witness the final critical hours of the Iran crisis. Carter Press Secretary Jody Powell narrates this excerpt from the award-winning ABC News broadcast, America Held Hostage, The Secret Negotiations.
At this point, the president had last been to sleep about midnight, not that night, but the night before, Sunday night. So he had been up virtually since Sunday morning with only about an hour's rest. And all we really need to do at this point, we think, is to get the money, the frozen Iranian assets into an escrow account, get that agreement signed, have it certified, and notification go to the Iranian government. Then the hostages should leave.
All right. Hello, I just wonder if you had any report to give me. Nothing concerning the airport?
The red telephone is a secure telephone. This is one of dozens of conversations that the president and others from the Oval Office had with our intelligence agencies over the course of the 24 to 48 hours before the release to keep constantly informed on any information they had that might be important to the situation.
Right on, man. That's great. That's great. Okay, now, the next step then. Now, the bank, okay, so the Bank of England has certified the depository?
It's now shortly before 7 o'clock. And the President has just been notified by the Secretary of the Treasury, William Miller, that the United States has completed the process of transferring the appropriate amount of the frozen Iranian assets into the escrow account at the Bank of England.
The money's in the bank. Our action is complete. Iran's being notified through Algeria that the money's there. That's all you need to tell them.
He thought, we all thought, that certification process, which basically did not involve any action on the part of the United States government at all, would take something in the neighborhood of 15, perhaps 30 minutes. As it turned out, that became almost an hour and a half.
It would help. Good deal. Thank you. Cyrus? Good to have you over. Thanks, sir.
Secretary Vance, of course, has been part of the plans since for months. His role being to leave as soon as we know that they're going to be that they're on their way back, to try to meet them when they get off the plane.
You and I are probably the only two people that all the hostages would recognize.
I think so.
They wouldn't recognize Dave or might recognize Chris back down. I think it'd be nice if you would let agree to
All right.
if you don't have
I'll
any
do that.
objection. Then you can plan on coming back with me.
Fine, that'd be wonderful. That's great.
Various ways that a briefing of the President can be interrupted. That's one of the more unusual, but sure one of the more pleasant for him. Your cameraman happens to apparently has sources of information that the United States government does not, because he turns and focuses on the clock at almost a precise moment that the Algerian government is delivering that certification to the government of Iran. We, of course, don't know that, and it's about 10 minutes before we get word that has taken place. That picture, I think, comes as close to summing up the last few days of this administration as any I've seen. The President on the telephone, on the secure phone, and the First Lady waiting expectantly to see what next. By this time, Jerry Rafshoon and other friends of the President that have been with him for a long time have begun to gather, some of them in the Oval Office, some of them outside in the anteroom. It's very obvious to all of us that very shortly the President will have to leave the Oval Office for the last time to go over to welcome the President-elect and the new First Lady to the White House. And that it's very unlikely at this point that he will have the opportunity, which we've worked for so long, to walk out and announce to the country that our people are on their way back. The President leaves the Oval Office for the last time shortly after 10:20 to walk across to the diplomatic reception area to receive Governor and Mrs. Reagan. At that point, he's not had a chance to change into his morning coat. He has had a chance to get his hair cut at the First Lady's request. And after they come in and are seated, he has to excuse himself briefly to change into the inaugural attire.
We have a report. Barbara, excuse me, I am just told that the Associated Press reports that the hostages are leaving the airport. Now, we can't go any further than that on that report, but it comes to us from Associated Press. I don't know whether it's filed. It must be filed from Tehran. And they say that the hostages are leaving the airport. Imagine that. We are within half an hour of the transition of power.
We'll see if he's heard about the hostages. Here he comes. Mr. President, are the hostages out?
Can't say yet.
Not yet.
Sam.
Not yet. Is that what he said, Frank? I couldn't hear it.
Not yet.
Not yet. Not yet. They've cheated him. They've cheated him right down to the end. I understand, Frank, and I must tell you that I cannot tell you why I understand that the planes had been sitting at the end of the runway literally for several hours this morning. I can only assume that the hostages were aboard. but
Yes.
that the Iranians would not let them go.
I'd like to hear from Ted Koppel before the president-elect comes out. Ted, can you come in and give us any late information on the hostages?
Yes, I can, Frank. What's happening, and this will mean a lot more, I suppose, to journalists out there, UPI has just gone with a flash, which is, in effect, the highest, the most important notification of news that they can give. The last time they did it was with the Kennedy assassination. It's 2 words. It says, hostages freed. No more details from UPI. AP, as you have been reporting for several minutes now, has said that a plane carrying the 52 American hostages took off from Tehran's Mehrabad airport. They are attributing that to a policeman at the airport who is alleged to have told that to reporters, but we have no independent confirmation yet.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
And will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
The Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution.
All of us feel, Frank.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you very much. That certainly was welcome news to him.
Thank God. They're in the air. They're free.
So glad to see you alive.
It's good to be home.
God bless Americans, man.